take a look at the central question of Rousseau's On the Social Contract. His central question really seems to be, what makes government legitimate? Okay. How do freedom and obligation work together? He first expresses this question in the introduction when he says, I mean to inquire if, in the civil order, there can be any sure and legitimate rule of administration, men being taken as they are, and laws as they might be. In this inquiry, I shall endeavor always to unite what right sanctions with what is prescribed by interest, in order that justice and utility may in no case be divided. What this boils down to is, human beings have rights. They also have interests. And we need to know, how can our rights and our interests both be met? He restates the problem in chapter 6 when he says, the problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. This is the fundamental problem of which the social contract provides the solution. So this boils down to, we need a community in which each of us is protected by the rest, each of us has a genuine obligation to obey, and yet each of us maintains genuine freedom, and we obey only ourselves. We'll have some key terms that we see as we go through this section. Okay. Convention, compact, and contract are really important terms. They're used more or less interchangeably in the text. And a convention, a compact, or a contract is simply an agreement that we make. And Rousseau is going to argue that this is an agreement, in the case of the social contract, that we need to make freely. We'll also see the words alienate or alienation at various points in the text. Okay? And to alienate is simply to put something at a distance from myself. For example, if I own a piece of property, I alienate it from myself by selling it. And alienation is simply the noun form of the word. A central question for Rousseau really is the basis for legitimate authority. And one thing that is going to become very clear is that strength does not give the right to rule. In large part, this is because all human beings are born equal and free. Okay. Rousseau gives the example of parenthood to illustrate this. He says, parenthood does not give parents lifetime rights over their children. It gives them rights over their children while the children still need their care. Once the children are independent, it's only bonds of affection that keep the family united. The continued unity of the family is voluntary. Now, we can voluntarily give up some of our liberty. This is possible. Okay? But we do this only if we gain something useful in return. Okay? That means that might does not make right. Strength does not give anyone the right to rule. We are only obligated to obey legitimate authority. Okay? Someone can use the threat of force to make us obey. It does not give them the right to our obedience. We don't have an obligation to obey authority in that case. In fact, as soon as we can free ourselves from the aggressor, we have the right to reclaim our liberty. Okay? So the right of conquest is not a right at all. We cannot renounce our liberty. Okay? In fact, to do so would be to renounce our dignity as human beings, in Rousseau's view. Okay? And the result of that is that conventions or agreements must be the basis of all legitimate authority. And as Rousseau puts it at the beginning of chapter 4, he says, "Since no man has a natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right, we must conclude that conventions form the basis of all legitimate authority among men." It is conventions, then, that give the right to rule. Okay? Because we are free, no one can legitimately rule over us without our consent. Okay? And this means that the very first and most important convention is the one that forms a people or a political body. Okay? Moreover, the first convention must be unanimous. Okay? Here's why it has to be unanimous. Okay? Rousseau puts it this way. He says, "Indeed, if there were no prior convention, where, unless the election were unanimous, would be the obligation on the minority to submit to the choice of the majority? How have 100 men who wish for a master the right to vote on behalf of 10 who do not? The law of majority voting is itself something established by convention, and presupposes unanimity on one occasion at least." Okay? So essentially, if the first convention were not unanimous, it would be the agreement of only some. And for those who didn't agree, it would violate their freedom. So where would be their obligation to obey? It's not there. Now, that first convention, that first agreement that forms the political body is going to look something like this. Okay. Each of us gives ourselves and our rights to the whole community. Okay. And that, of course, includes each of us. Okay. Since the whole community includes us, and since the conditions are the same for everyone, we all remain equal. Okay? And since this is a unanimous decision, we freely make it, so we don't give up our liberty. And Rousseau puts it this way in chapter 6. He says, "The essence of the social contract is this: each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole." We'll talk more about the general will when we take up the remaining chapters of Book 1.